All right, so today we're going to dive into some news out of Nepal,
Sounds good.
where it seems like there's a pretty interesting resurgence of support for the monarchy.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that's kind of surprising considering that they abolished the monarchy. What was it, like almost 20 years ago now?
Yeah, 2008, I believe.
Yeah, 2008. So yeah, almost 20 years, and now there's this renewed interest.
Right, and it's especially interesting because there's this event that kind of sparked a lot of conversation, and that's the return of the former King Gyanendra.
Right. Yeah, former King Gyanendra Shah.
Exactly.
And so we've pulled some articles from a couple of different sources to kind of get into this a little bit. We've got Nepal News and Al Jazeera,
Okay.
and we're going to try to kind of figure out, what's going on here. What is behind this resurgence in support, and is this a real possibility? Could the monarchy actually return to Nepal?
Right. What does this all mean for Nepal's political future?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the big surprise here is that it really seemed like, when the monarchy was abolished, that was kind of it, it felt like it was settled.
Felt like a done deal.
Yeah, exactly. And now here we are all these years later and people are taking to the streets, there are these large demonstrations.
There's a visible presence.
Yeah, and a lot of energy behind it.
Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, let's start with this return of Gyanendra.
Yes.
So he came back to Kathmandu after a tour around the western part of Nepal on March 9th.
Yeah, March 9th.
And the welcome he received, I mean, was pretty substantial. I mean, what stood out to you from these articles about the kind of reaction that he got?
Well, I think the sheer number of people who showed up to greet him at the Tribhuvan International Airport is pretty striking.
Right.
Both Nepal News and Al Jazeera,
Mm.
they highlighted this huge pro-monarchy demonstration, and we're talking about an estimated 10,000 supporters.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It is a considerable showing, and it really speaks to the level of enthusiasm and support that he's receiving.
And it wasn't just, people kind of showing up. There were organized groups there, right?
Right. It wasn't just a spontaneous gathering. There were various factions that were present, including the Rastriya Prajatantra Party, the RPP.
Right. And they've always been kind of a pro-monarchy party, haven't they?
They have. They've consistently advocated for a constitutional monarchy,
Mhm.
and they hold a significant base of support.
Yeah, and then there was also Durga Prasad, who's become a pretty vocal figure in all of this.
Absolutely. He's very outspoken, and his presence there, alongside these other organized groups, suggests that this isn't just a matter of nostalgia.
Right.
There are segments within Nepali society that are actively working towards, the potential return of the monarchy.
Yeah, and I mean, even the slogans that people were chanting were pretty powerful. Things like "Our King, our country dearer than life," and "Come King, save the nation."
Right. Very vocative language.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that really makes you think, okay, this isn't just a few people who are kind of reminiscing about the old days. This is,
It's something deeper.
yeah, it's something deeper.
Yeah. And it's interesting too because it's not just happening on the streets.
Hmm.
Nepal News also highlighted a surge of monarchist sentiment on social media.
Right. It's interesting how that always seems to go hand in hand these days.
It does, right?
Yeah.
You have these events happening in the real world, and then it spills over into the digital sphere and it gets amplified.
Right, and it's almost like this selective remembering of the past. You see people sharing these idealized images of former kings Mahendra and Birendra.
Right. It's like this curated version of history.
Exactly, and I think that's something that we have to be mindful of because social media can be a very powerful tool for shaping narratives.
Absolutely. And it often simplifies complex legacies and, as you said, focuses on these perceived past glories.
Right, so it's not the full picture.
No, it's not.
So we're seeing this visible and vocal support, but the question is why now?
All right. What's fueling this?
Yeah, what's driving this apparent shift in sentiment, or at least this public expression of pro-monarchy feeling?
Well, and this is where our sources really converge on a central cause, and that is this widespread public dissatisfaction with the current political landscape.
Right.
Nepal News really emphasized that this pro-monarchy sentiment is largely a symptom of these deeper frustrations that have been building over time.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
What are the main issues that are making people look back at the monarchy, despite its history and its eventual abolition?
Well, there are several key factors that are at play here, and one of the major ones is political instability.
Right.
Nepal has had 13 different governments since the monarchy was abolished back in
Mhm.
2008.
It's hard to even keep track of that many changes.
It's a lot of turnover,
Mhm.
and it really highlights the challenges that they faced in establishing a stable and effective government.
And it makes you wonder, you know, is it even possible to implement any long-term policies or plans when you have that kind of constant change?
Right. It's incredibly difficult, and that's a point that's often debated in the polypolitical circles.
Yeah.
And so you have that instability, and then you couple that with what's perceived as chronic governance failure.
Right. So it's not just that the governments are changing, it's that there's this feeling that the country isn't being run well.
Exactly.
Mm.
There's a sense that the basic functions of government are not being fulfilled effectively.
And that's got to be incredibly frustrating for people.
It is, and then on top of that, you have these very real everyday issues that people are grappling with.
Right. The things that people are dealing with in their daily lives.
Exactly. So you have
That-
corruption, which is a major source of public anger.
Right. I mean, that's a problem in a lot of countries, but it seems like it's particularly acute in Nepal.
It's a very serious issue, and then you have rising inflation, high unemployment rates, and this overall sense of economic stagnation.
Right. So people are struggling to make ends meet.
They are, and they feel like the current ruling parties are completely out of touch with their struggles.
Yeah, it's like that disconnect between the people in power and the everyday citizens.
Exactly, and there's a growing sentiment that democracy in its current manifestation in Nepal hasn't really delivered on the promises that were made over the past 3 decades.
So it's like people are looking back and saying, you know what, maybe things were better before.
Yeah, there's a sense of disillusionment with the current state of affairs.
And it seems like Gyanendra is trying to capitalize on this discontent.
He is. He's definitely trying to tap into that sentiment.
Yeah, Nepal News pointed out his Democracy Day message where he was pretty critical of the state of the economy, the education system, and the overall functioning of democracy.
Right. He was very vocal in his critique, and he called for unity and decisive action.
It sounds like he's trying to position himself as a potential solution.
He's trying to present himself as a figure who could bring stability and positive change to the country.
And to a certain extent, that message might resonate with people who are feeling frustrated and looking for alternatives.
It might, particularly those who are disillusioned with the current political establishment.
Now, how are the current political players reacting to this?
Well, as you might expect, reactions have been varied.
Okay.
Nepal News detailed the stances of several key parties and figures like Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli and Sher Bahadur Dubba from the Nepali Congress. They've largely downplayed the significance of these pro-monarchy demonstrations.
Interesting. So they're trying to project an image of control.
Yeah, it seems like they're trying to suggest that they don't pose a serious threat to the republic.
But you got to wonder if there's some underlying concern there.
It's possible. I mean,
Yeah.
there's always that possibility when you see this kind of groundswell of support for an alternative system.
Right.
Now, Pushpo Kamal Dahal Prachanda from the CPN Mao Center, he's offered a more alarmist perspective.
Oh, okay. So he's taking it more seriously.
He warned that Nepal's democratic achievements are at risk, and he accused the current ruling parties of creating an environment where the former king can gain traction through their own failures in governance.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
It is. It suggests that there's at least one major political camp that's genuinely worried about this resurgence.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he's pointing the finger at the current ruling parties and saying, you know, you're actually the ones who are paving the way for this to happen.
Right? He's saying that their failures are creating this opportunity for the former king to step in.
Now, what about the other parties that were mentioned?
Well, Manhav Kumar Nepal of the CPN, Unified Socialist, he echoed some of Prachanda's concerns. He directly criticized PM Oli and attributed the rise of these quote-unquote reactionary elements to the government's incompetence.
Right, so it's not just Prachanda who's seeing this as a potential problem.
No, and then you have Rabi Lamashane of,
Yeah.
of the Rashtriya Swatantra Party, and he also weighed in criticizing the government's failure to address the legitimate grievances of the public.
So there's a sense that across the political spectrum, there's at least some acknowledgement that the government isn't doing enough to address these underlying issues.
Right, and it's interesting that Nepal News also mentioned planned counter-protests by opposition parties.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're trying to push back against this pro-monarchy sentiment.
Yeah, it seems like there's this growing polarization around this issue.
So it's clearly a very sensitive and and potentially divisive topic.
It is, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this all plays out in the coming months and years.
Okay, so we've talked about the demonstrations, the public sentiment, the reactions from the political parties, but let's get to the really big question here. What's the actual likelihood of the monarchy being restored in Nepal?
Right, so if we step back and look at the bigger picture, I think that the consensus from our sources is that the probability of restoration in the current context is very low.
Okay, so despite all of this, energy and attention, it's still unlikely.
Yeah, the obstacles are substantial.
Okay.
So legally, the 2015 Constitution very firmly establishes Nepal as a republic.
Right.
And to amend it, to reinstate the monarchy, would require a two-thirds majority vote in parliament.
Yeah, that's a very high bar to clear.
It is. And politically, as we've discussed the major parties, they all officially support the Republican framework.
Right, even if some of them are downplaying the seriousness of this pro-monarchy movement.
Right. And so securing that two-thirds majority seems practically impossible.
And even the smaller parties that support the monarchy, they don't have the numbers to even get the ball rolling on that kind of amendment.
Right. They lack the parliamentary strength to even initiate that process.
And then historically, when we've seen these major political shifts in Nepal, they've often required widespread popular uprisings.
Right. Those really large-scale movements.
Yeah, and sometimes even the backing of India.
Yes. External support has played a role in the past.
And neither of those factors seem to be present right now.
No, not to the extent that would be necessary to really overturn the existing system.
And, Nepal News also made the point that while these pro-monarchy rallies are noticeable, they haven't really coalesced into a sustained nationwide movement.
Right. They lack that kind of momentum that you would need to really challenge a fundamental system like a republic.
Yeah, it's one thing to have these sporadic demonstrations, but it's another thing entirely to have this kind of ongoing pressure that could actually force change.
Right. And then there's the role of the military to consider.
Right.
The Nepal Army now operates under a democratic framework, and there's really no indication that they would support a return to royal rule.
Yeah, it seems like the historical ties between the monarchy and the military have significantly weakened.
They have, particularly since 2006.
Right. And then geopolitically, Nepal News makes it clear that, key international players like India, China, and the United States, they all support Nepal's democratic institutions.
Right. They're all invested in the current system.
Yeah, and Gyanendra doesn't seem to have any powerful international allies who are actively advocating for his return.
No, he lacks that kind of external backing.
And that's historically been very important for exiled royal families. They often rely on that support to even attempt to regain power.
Right. It gives them legitimacy and resources.
And then finally, Gyanendra himself hasn't really been actively building a political organization.
Right. He hasn't been doing the groundwork.
Yeah, he's not out there forming a political party or contesting elections.
And without that kind of direct political engagement, his prospects for a return remain slim.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine him just kind of stepping back into power without having that kind of political infrastructure in place.
Right. He needs to be actively involved in the political process.
So despite all this talk and all this activity, it sounds like the practical realities make a restoration of the monarchy highly improbable.
At this point, yes, that seems to be the case.
Okay.
The underlying public frustration is real.
Right.
And it's understandable, but translating that into a fundamental change in the system is a whole other challenge.
Yeah, it's a much bigger hurdle to overcome.
It is.
Now, the Nepal News also talked about the electoral performance of royalist parties since 2008.
Right.
And they've had some small gains here and there, but they haven't really been able to turn that street-level support into significant political power.
Yeah, that disconnect is interesting.
It is. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's several factors that likely contribute to that.
Oh.
Nepal News points to a lack of strong organizational structures.
So they're not as well organized as the bigger parties.
Right. They don't have the same level of infrastructure and resources.
And they probably don't have the same level of funding either.
Exactly. Financial resources are crucial for running effective campaigns. And then perhaps most importantly, they lack a comprehensive policy platform that goes beyond simply advocating for the restoration of the monarchy.
Right. So it's like their whole platform is just, we want to go back to the way things were.
Exactly. And that might appeal to a certain segment of the population.
Yeah, people who are nostalgic for the past.
But it doesn't offer a vision for the future.
Right, and it doesn't really address those underlying issues that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly, and so they're not able to connect with voters on a broader level.
And then there's also the issue of internal divisions within the royalist movement.
Right, they're not a unified force.
No. And Nepal News pointed out that there are all these different splinter groups.
each with their own leaders and agendas.
Yeah, figures like Rajendra Lingden, Durga Prazai, Keshar Bahadur Bista were all mentioned.
Yeah, and there's just this lack of unified leadership
Hmm.
and a cohesive strategy.
So it's like they're kind of fighting amongst themselves.
In a way, yes, and that weakens their ability to present a credible challenge to the existing political establishment.
Right. It's hard to be taken seriously as a political force when you're constantly battling within your own ranks.
Exactly.
It's easy to forget why the monarchy was abolished in the first place.
Right. It wasn't just a random decision.
Yeah, it wasn't just like, oh, let's try something new.
No, there were very specific historical events that led to that outcome.
Right. Nepal News reminds us of the Maoist insurgency, which
Wow.
lasted for a decade.
Right, from 1996 to 2006.
Yeah, and that created a huge amount of instability, and it really challenged the existing order.
It did, and then of course there was the tragic royal massacre of 2001.
Right, where King Birendra and many members of his family were killed.
A shocking event.
Yeah, and that really shook the nation and raised these serious questions about the future of the monarchy.
It cast a shadow over the institution.
And then, of course, there was Gyanendra's reign,
Right.
which seemed to accelerate the move towards abolition.
It did. His decision in 2005 to seize absolute power, dismissing the elected government and parliament.
Yeah, that was a pretty controversial move.
It was, and it triggered widespread protests and condemnation from the international community.
Right, it was seen as a step backwards for democracy.
Exactly, and it really fueled the movement to abolish the monarchy entirely.
And so the reinstatement of Parliament in 2006 was a direct response to that public pressure.
It was, and it paved the way for the vote in 2008 that officially declared Nepal a republic.
So it wasn't just this, sudden whim. It was the culmination of years of conflict and instability and ultimately a loss of public trust.
Right, a loss of faith in the monarchy.
Yeah, so I think it's important to keep that historical context in mind when we're talking about this current pro-monarchy sentiment.
Absolutely, because the reasons for the abolition haven't just vanished.
Right, they're still there.
They are.
Yeah. Now, we talk a lot about why people might be looking back to the monarchy, but Nepal News also talks about the deeper underlying causes of frustration that go beyond this whole monarchy versus republic debate.
Right, it's not just about the form of government.
No, what are some of those systemic issues that are fueling this discontent?
Well, I think this is where we get to the heart of the matter.
Okay.
You know, the pro-monarchy sentiment might be a symptom of something much larger.
Right.
And Nepal News outlines several key issues.
Yeah.
One of the biggest ones is the failure of the political transition to deliver genuine stability and effective governance.
So even though they transitioned away from the monarchy, they haven't necessarily achieved those goals of stability and good governance.
Exactly. And the frequent changes in government and the constant infighting among these political factions, it just creates this pervasive sense of instability.
And it makes it hard to get anything done.
It does. It hinders long-term progress. Yeah. And there's this widespread perception that politicians are more focused on maintaining power than on actually serving the people.
Right. It's like they're more interested in their own self-preservation than in the well-being of the country.
Exactly. And this has led to economic stagnation, high inflation, and these really high unemployment rates.
And those are the things that are affecting people in their everyday lives.
Absolutely. These are the issues that people are grappling with on a daily basis.
And it's not just the economy, it's also the basic public services.
Right. Things like road maintenance, access to electricity, and clean water, adequate health.
Yeah, those are the things that really impact people's quality of life.
They do. And there's a sense that the government is failing to deliver in these areas.
And then there's the issue of corruption.
Right. That pervasive problem.
Yeah, and that just undermines trust in the entire system.
It does. It erodes faith in institutions and in the political process.
So you can see why people are feeling frustrated.
Absolutely.
And Nepal News also talks about the lack of accountability.
Right, the fact that there are no real consequences for corruption or incompetence.
And that just perpetuates the cycle.
It does. And then you have the brain drain issue, the significant outmigration of youth seeking better opportunities abroad.
Yeah, that's a problem for a lot of countries.
It is, and it's a particularly acute problem for Nepal.
So it sounds like there are some very serious challenges facing the country.
There are, and they need to be addressed.
Right.
Regardless of what form of government is in place.
So we've come to the end of our deep dive into this very complex situation in Nepal.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has, and I think the key takeaway here is that while there's this resurgence of pro-monarchy sentiment, the practicalities of restoring the monarchy are incredibly difficult.
They are.
And the real source of the discontent seems to be these broader failures in governance.
Right. The issues that are affecting people's daily lives.
Yeah, so it's not just about the monarchy versus the republic, it's about something much deeper.
It's about the fundamental functioning of the state.
So as you, the listener, are processing all of this information, here's a final thought to consider.
Okay.
Given the current political climate in Nepal, is this focus on the monarchy a distraction?
Interesting question.
Yeah, is it taking attention and energy away from those more fundamental issues of governance and accountability?
Right. The things that really need to be addressed.
Yeah, and could this moment of heightened public sentiment actually be an opportunity for real reform within the existing republic?
Right. Could it be a catalyst for positive change?
Yeah, I mean, it's something to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.